Welcome to the second semester as we take a look at American history, all the way from the earliest days of the Mesoamericans and the explorers, all the way up until the time of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, there's one thing you may not actually have noticed about the way that we have divided up American history. That's quite simple. One of the ways we divided it up is in the first semesters you've already gone through, you've already put in all of that work. That took you from those early beginnings all the way up until the Constitution was signed and ratified. This semester, we're taking a look at the time of George Washington until the time of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, what's unusual about that is typically American history courses don't divide things up that way. A typical American history course takes you from the explorers all the way until 1865, when the Civil War ended, or the war between the states came to a conclusion. We're doing things a little bit differently because it's so rich here at the founding period. It's so rich even prior to that at the colonial period, and it's going to be quite rich in that period leading up to the war between the states and, of course, from there on as well. And so we've really shifted priorities to take a look at some of these heroes and really highlight them in such a way that you're going to know this section of American history better than most students would had they gone through a typical history course. Now, today's lecture is titled Federal Headship, and we're going to be taking a look at George Washington. We've already mentioned him, of course, as a character. He shows up all over the map in American history. But we're going to take a look at George Washington as a man, as a biography, and especially as president, along with the men that he put in power with himself when he served those 2 terms as president. What we're going to be looking at, though, is the fact that the Constitution really provided for faithfulness. That's what the whole word federal means. It comes from Latin, foedus, which means fidelity or faithfulness or covenant. And the whole idea behind the Constitution was that the Constitution couldn't actually make people faithful. Nothing like a document can do that. It actually required people to be faithful in order for the Constitution to be used properly. In fact, the Founding Fathers understood this. They always had this concept that without faithfulness, without self-government, without things like proper virtue and ultimately faith, there would be no way that you would actually have a just and righteous nation that also had mercy and humility. In fact, let me read to you their words. We'll start with George Washington, who is our topic. He said this: "The foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality. The propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained." Or consider this quote by John Adams: "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." So when we take a look at federal leadership, when we take a look at faithful leadership, you have to keep in mind that the system, as brilliant as it was, and as designed as it was to impose checks and balances, to actually try to check the fallen state of man, it can't do that alone. After all, it's just a system. It's impersonal. You have to enter man. You have to enter a personal operator. Someone actually has to function in government using the Constitution, and that requires virtue. That requires faithfulness, or really the argument of American history is that requires faith itself. Faith in a supreme being that is above you, that interacts in the world, yet he's also completely outside of the world. Someone who actually saves us from ourselves, from the fall itself. That, of course, is the whole message of the gospel. Now, another thing I want to point out about federal headship is that the whole idea of federal headship is very similar to what a father does. A father is in a position to lead his family. He's in a position to be a good husband as well as a good father. He's in a position to actually create independent states, so to speak, out of his children. After all, a father has authority over the household, but the whole idea is that the children eventually leave home, and they essentially form their own families, their own nation states, if you will. And as a result, he still has influence over them, but they're independent. That really was American leadership at its best, and that's what Washington did very well. He was an incredible father-like leader. In fact, there are 3 traits that you're going to note for this principle. 3 ways in which Washington really showed incredible federal headship. The first was that Washington was a visionary. He was someone who was always looking ahead. He was someone who always showed initiative. He was a trailblazer. In other words, Washington was willing to try things that hadn't been tried, say, in the recent history of America, but had been tried in past lessons, especially lessons of Christendom. But he was willing to try those things and put himself out on a limb for the sake of others. He was someone who was always thinking, what does the future hold? What are the future dangers of the country that I can warn about now? In fact, you see that in a document such as his farewell address, when he gave very specific warnings that particularly apply to the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries. The second role that Washington really shows well in terms of federal vision was that he was a steady operator. In fact, what Washington showed very well was that he believed in the ordinary life. He believed in that whole priestly role that requires faithfulness on a daily basis. You actually have to be faithful in the small things, such as how do you treat the people around you, the people in your family? How are you faithful in the things that you do on a daily basis, in your habits? How are you faithful in the things that you're pursuing? Are you deliberate about them? Are you patient? Most of all, are you content? Washington was a man who really found himself, or I should say, made himself content in all the situations of life that he was given. Not only that, but Washington was incredible in the sense that he was always willing to submit to authority. He always recognized that no matter how much influence or how much clout or power he actually had, there was always something that he was submitting to or someone he was submitting to. That's what made him an incredible leader. It also made him someone who was consistently able to resist revolution. He was able to resist the whole idea that if something isn't working, you just get rid of it. Instead, you find small ways to begin changing it, to begin reforming it. Finally, Washington was an incredible commander. He was someone who, by his very presence in a room, someone by the way that he spoke, by the way that he carried himself, tended to command a natural respect. And he commanded that respect by his presence and especially by his character. So he wasn't the kind of person who had to rely upon a personality of humor or a personality of someone who bossed others around to get his way. He wasn't someone who had to rely upon cleverness to try and trick or manipulate people into doing what he wanted them to do. Rather, simply by leading by outstanding character and outstanding example of how he was as a man himself, that inspired people to serve well. These are lessons to keep in mind as we take a look at Washington's life.